All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our very first show of 2026. This is Reality Speaks TV, and I'm your host, Sparkle Denise. This is our very first show, and I'm so excited about the topic. We're beginning the year with an important and necessary conversation about redlining in the city of Utica, not just as history, but as something that continues to shape housing, opportunity, and community life today. Tonight's conversation is grounded in documented historical records, maps, and archive research shared by Professor Jeff Miller of Utica University. And we're also joined by student minister Brother Courtney Muhammad, who brings community, cultural, and spiritual perspective to how these policies affected real people and families. This is a learning space, a respectful space, and a conversation our city deserves. Welcome.
Thanks, Sparkle Denise.
Happy
Happy New Year.
New Year. So, I have an icebreaker question. And the question is for you, Brother Courtney. Before we get into heavy history, when you think about home or neighborhood, what does that mean to you personally?
Well, first off, in the name of God, however you may call his name, Jah, Jehovah, Yahweh, the Father, the Creator, the Sustainer, I greet you in the greeting words of peace, which in Arabic is Assalamu alaikum, or just peace be unto you. I feel fortunate that I did grow up in a area in which you knew your neighbors and your neighbors had similar issues and concerns that you had. And I was fortunate also to have a mother that was very proactive, and that even though she worked and my father worked, she recognized the blight in the community in many fatherless homes and alcoholism, but she always worked to help to uplift everyone in the community. So our house became a home, a healing place for many of the folks that were part of our neighborhood, part of my community. So they looked like me, they played like me. Unfortunately, poverty played a major role in which marginalized them, but at the same time, my mother did not allow poverty to be an excuse or a reason not to succeed or excel. She always believed that no matter what our condition, through education, we can rise. It might not happen in this particular generation, but if we continue to pursue education, higher education, and a true knowledge of ourselves, we can come out of the conditions that people look down on. But in real time, I didn't look to go anywhere else. I was very satisfied in my community, the neighborhoods around our home. Um, in some cases, there were probably people who would say, "Don't go in those areas." This will happen to you or that'll happen to you. But that was home for me and many of my friends and associates, and we had a good time. We didn't really look, or at least I was not um, made to look at what someone else has and want to have what they have. We were being taught by my mother to be very appreciative of what we have in our community at that point, and to try to do our best to make do with what we had, and then start to increase. So I'll go with that for icebreaker.
Thank you, Brother Courtney. So, Professor Miller, so you see, right now I'm reading Professor of Communications and Media. For some reason, I didn't know that until just now. So, so for your icebreaker, Professor Miller, what first drew you to studying cities, neighborhoods, and how policy shapes community life?
That's a challenging question. My research career has been quite varied over the years. I always admire my colleagues who have a single agenda and they study the same thing for 35 years. That is probably very satisfying. I wish I knew what that was like, but instead, I've often had my research interests sort of, they've arrived very surreptitiously. And I will say that the current research that I'm doing related to Utica really started quite a long time ago. My wife and I bought our first house right on the New Hartford Utica border near Utica College at the time. Being a nerd, of course, I read every document they gave me when we bought the house. Who wouldn't? And it included, our title abstract, and that's when I first encountered a racial covenant in the title abstract for our home. At the time, I really didn't know what I had discovered. I'm not a historian. I'm a communication professor, but I had already been doing fairly extensive archive research in Syracuse related to community organizing and the war on poverty in 1964, primarily through a training program at Syracuse University that was sending social welfare students into the 15th Ward to organize communities for political and economic power. And there is an extensive collection of documents that had been sealed for 50 years. And I have to admit, I did that research for a very long time, more than 10 years, learning about the efforts of Warren Hagstrom, who was the professor of social work, and also he had brought in folks like Saul Alinsky and a whole raft of important community organizers and activists at the time. But when I hit a brick wall there, I decided to turn my focus back to Utica because, we're a relatively small city, and relatively small cities usually don't attract a whole lot of attention from scholars. But I did have on my bookshelf a book I had found called Decision Making in Syracuse. It was fascinating. It was a group of professors from Michigan who studied how political and economic decisions were made in Syracuse in the 1960s. I would love to have a similar book written about Utica. I have a friend in Buffalo who runs a bookshop, and they've just published a book on who rules Buffalo. I can't wait to read it. I'm originally from that area. But in doing my research, I found that book was quite interesting because something like 12 or 15 political scientists and other professors from Michigan studied every component of the power structure in Syracuse. And yet there's no mention of the Black community whatsoever in that book. Not related to housing, not related to politics, not related to jobs or economics, not related to culture in any way. It's as if they somehow mysteriously had blinders on and didn't see what was happening in the 15th Ward and in the Water Washington neighborhood, not to mention what was going on in the rest of the city as well. So, I had that in my backpack when I started to look at Utica, and I have to say I'm quite surprised that no one else has been doing this work, but I'm glad to do it. It's as I joke with my students, I found a job that pays me for whatever is wrong with my brain. So, so I'm quite compelled to do this kind of work, and thank goodness I can earn a living and also learn about why the world functions the way it does.
Wow, you said a lot there. I really appreciate that. That's why I asked that great question to start us off. So I want to, get us now to the foundation of this conversation today. Professor Miller, this question, I'm going to start with you again, is going to be for those of us who may not be familiar with redlining. What is redlining, and how was it formerly used in American cities like Utica?
Yeah, so in my research, I actually look at two sort of related things there, and they kind of are like a 1-2 punch. One is redlining, and the other is racial covenants, and in fact, they work hand in hand. to harm people of color and also immigrant groups, but primarily people of color. And repeatedly all throughout my research, that's what the evidence bears out. But redlining is something that happened in Utica. The federal government under FDR in 1933, ostensibly to deal with the crashing markets and the fact that it was something like 1,000 mortgages a day were going into default. They were trying to essentially stop the bleeding, because if the housing market went any lower, it was going to increase the pain of the Great Depression. And between 1935 and 1940, they created maps of about 240 cities around the country. And the maps color-coded neighborhoods based on data that was gathered mostly by local realtors, local bankers, local housing developers and contractors, in some cases, local government officials. And in fact, there seems to be pretty good evidence that most of these local folks, including in Utica, in all likelihood, they conducted what were called windshield observations, which meant they would park in a neighborhood and not even bother to get out of the car, because the data they were sending to the federal government already included all of their biases, all of their prejudices. And in many cases, these folks were directly benefiting from the buying and selling of real estate. So they were providing data that was benefiting them or their businesses directly, and also just reproducing in the process all of the racial and ethnic prejudices in all of their cities, including Utica. And so, the Utica redlining map was created around 1937, and it's pretty easy to Google and find it. If you have a map of Utica in your head, you can kind of imagine that the red-lined areas, these were the areas that were considered very low security. Now, when I try to explain to my students, some people think, oh, well, security means, am I going to get mugged in the neighborhood? No, it had literally nothing to do with that. It had to do with the security of loans. So originally, the original purpose of redlining maps was federal government advice to lenders and mortgage companies. And the colors were supposed to give them advice on the likelihood that a mortgage would get paid back. That's what residential security originally meant. In other words, how safe is your mortgage? But of course, all of that, like everything in the culture, gets overlaid with race, with ethnicity, and with class. And so regardless of what the stated intentions were of creating these maps, even long after people were not, getting their mortgages from the HOLC agency, banks, well into the late 80s, early 90s, were still redlining the same neighborhoods. And so we still see this ongoing continued legacy of not only the neighborhoods that were colored red on the map, which in Utica sort of stretch eastward along Bleecker Street and westward along Oriskany Boulevard. All of New York Mills was redlined because of the large population of mostly Polish immigrants. Central, the neighborhood known as Central Utica, was redlined, which is north of Oriskany Boulevard and essentially located between the Memorial Auditorium and the Yorkville border. And at that time, that was primarily where most Black folks in Utica lived, along the railroad tracks in that neighborhood. And obviously, and also down the west side as well. It had devastating legacy effects. And that's one of the reasons why I do the research and why I present locally, because, some of the legacies we find are things like, quality of housing stock, crime statistics. It affects educational outcomes. It affects people's health and well-being. It affects their political participation. It affects opportunity. There is endless data on everything you can imagine. And I'm not surprised that most of the modern data correlates very closely to the redlining maps of the 1930s. I think for most of those 239 cities, Sparkle, if you were to overlay a map today, let's say, of economic opportunity on top of the redlining maps from the 1930s, they're going to match pretty closely. If you want to map homes that have lead paint in them, it's going to map pretty closely. If you want to map things like single parent homes or high unemployment or exposure to commercial chemicals. In fact, there's even data that indicates that if a child that grows up in a formerly red-lined neighborhood has a exceptionally much higher chance of being incarcerated before the age of 30. There's even heat data. So one of the things I like to show when I present my research is that the neighborhood I mentioned before, north of Oriskany Boulevard, that neighborhood, if you compare it to one of the green-lined neighborhoods, that was one of the neighborhoods that was given a grade of A. And by the way, there were 3 green-lined neighborhoods on the Utica map, all of which fall within the town of New Hartford. And on any given day, the ground level heat difference can be as much as 9 degrees Fahrenheit between those 2 neighborhoods. So on any given day of the year, like the hottest day in July, it will be 9 degrees hotter along the railroad tracks north of Oriskany Boulevard than it will be down in New Hartford. And that's primarily because formerly red-lined neighborhoods have lots of blacktop and cement and have very few trees and very little green space. So of course, all that heat is just radiating. But if you look at the green line neighborhoods in New Hartford, they have very little blacktop, very little concrete, many more trees and lots of green space, which of course absorbs heat, and that relates directly to our health and well-being.
Woo, baby! Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Sure. I mean, I don't want to be that guy, but I have a map from the early 1900s that was commissioned by the City of Utica, where they traced neighborhoods that were lacking trees, and the neighborhoods that were lacking trees is exactly the neighborhood I just told you about, Central Utica, north of Oriskany Boulevard and along the railroad tracks. They had the least trees in 1907, so it's not like we didn't know.
Well, I was told from the Oneida County Historical Society that New Hartford was once for Black millionaires and mansions and space like that. So I'm just wondering about that too. Like, you're telling me about Utica, the New Hartford. So I'm wondering, it's just so many different questions that I have. But somebody who's watching, yes, thank you. That's exactly my point. Miss Edwards, that's a lot to depack, and thank you for this information. She's watching from Facebook, because even though you are saying this, we already know this, So,
well, as you and I were joking earlier, I have the receipts.
Yes.
So I realize there are a lot of folks that I'm not telling them anything new, but as the kids say, I've got the receipts.
Yes, and that's important.
Yeah, and it's also very important that, as you said in the beginning, that this is a result of policy. This is not the result of some sort of natural, random sorting of people. And it's also really not the natural sorting of people by their own biases or preferences, because, mostly local policy, land use policy, and also federal policies really dictated who could live where. Especially following World War I and especially after World War II, when we see lots of white families leaving city centers and moving out to all white suburbs, where they enjoyed brand new public goods and services, leaving behind the city with its old schools, old hospitals, old sewer systems, old electrical systems, old parks. And so in many ways, things like, the mortgage program through the VA, for example, and also through the FHA, in many ways, those were taxpayer funded relocation programs for white folks.
Well, so when I say all praise is due to the Most High Student Minister Brother Courtney Muhammad, this is the moment that I'm talking about for me in my 44 years of traveling in this space, in this time, in this realm. All praise is due to the Most High. I'm gonna ask you this question. This is where I present to you. So for me as a Black woman in America, it's just overwhelming for me. But it is refreshing to have this lived experience from this student minister here, who is well learned, this is the place where he was born, and you know what? I'm not even gonna do. Brother Courtney, here's your question for you. From the lived experience, how has redlining impacted Black and brown families generationally?
And listening to Jeff, there's other sides to your point. I'm more here not for the historical data and explaining fully redlining and its details with receipts. But to your point, I do have a lived experience in a way in which to still overcome. So as I'm listening to Jeff, as he's saying, these were laws. This didn't just happen exclusively in Utica or the neighboring cities. This was from our government that was passed down. So right now, just to give a little balance to or a deeper understanding, I guess, is we're in a study right now. I'm doing a study group that the topic of study is, can you be how does it go? Can you be part of a conspiracy and not even know it? Can you be part of a conspiracy and not even know it? And the study guide is hypocrisy and conspiracy. So I think, and I have to always reference my mother, because she kind of understood the conspiracy and the hypocrisy that takes place on a regular basis within the Black community and the wider communities. These hypocrisies are so in our face. And as you said, one of the listeners, is refreshing to hear our counterparts or someone who we look to for our knowledge to be able to explain a little more in detail what we experienced. So like I said, mom was a little ahead of the game. So she did not want us to be raised in an area that we didn't want, or when we're not wanted. So one of the sayings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is, don't go where you're not wanted at. And so with that said, she didn't say that to us, but she said to us, your father came out of Detroit as an engineer. He worked for General Electric, GE. They call it Generous Electric. And he had the means and his on those other Black engineers that came into this area, they had the means to move basically wherever they wanted to, but they were redlined. So my father just happened to live with a Black man who did live in North Utica. And he's of note in Utica because his name is Mr. Bass, who being that my father was so-called educated and came to work for GE, he took him in and was showing him kind of like the ropes of being a Black man that's a professional and how you need to move in this city so that you can kind of have the things that you would like. But unfortunately or fortunately, he met my mother, who came out of Harlem, New York, and very different experience. And she was not one to try to force integration. And so one of the things that she said is, I don't want my children to be raised in a community where they're not wanted. So that meant that my father had to find a house, whereas there was no red line, or the redlining was taking place, right? So it understood that areas in Utica, this is in the 50s and 60s, as a Black person of means, you just could not purchase. And with that said, my mother would kind of explain to us that living in a community that basically you have people who look like you, are struggling like you, have the same issues that you have, have the same means that you have, all together you can form a community, a neighborhood in which when you look at what you don't have, everybody else is in that same place. But as soon as you start to look to what someone else has, what happens is now your expectation starts to rise beyond the reality of the time. Now, I don't know if that makes sense, Sparkle. So she would say clearly, just because when you go into the areas which is all white, they have manicured lawns and the houses are very nice on the outside, she would very clearly say it doesn't mean that what's going on in the house, inside the house, is as peaceful as it looks outside of the house. I might need to slow down. But she explained that our condition is not that bad compared to those who look like they have it all. She said, at least you have your sanity. But she would explain that behind the wall in some of the white houses, which you would think it's like heaven on earth, she would explain in details that it's not. They have just as many problems as you have or we have in our community, and even more problems because they're carrying a burden of not knowing truly themselves, their government, and what is going on the planet today. So she gave us a sense that not that we were better than anyone, but the beautiful thing was that even though I had the wino that lived next door, matter of fact, I didn't just have the wino that lived next door to my home on Blandina Street was the wino house of the city of Utica. Broken Black men who had nowhere else to go, and the homeless thing wasn't a reality like it is today. But there was what we call Big Mama, who had a boarding house that broken Black men who drank from can't see in the morning to can't see at night and all through the night, where they can have a place to live and be dignified in their living outside of having a family and having the resources that they would need. And she would tell me clearly that just because they're broken, just because they're drinking, just because they're down on their luck today, it doesn't mean that they don't have anything of value to say to you and to teach you. So where people will look down on individuals growing up in the hood and recognizing the value of individuals that have lived through circumstances, lived through struggled through oppression, and that might have been down at that moment, to see them come up and see them change their life showed you that there's nothing that you can put us through that will destroy us. Now, it's clear many of us didn't make it out of the hood or the ghetto. It's understood. But those that did, we seem to soar higher than the average with less than what anybody else had. So there was always a feeling of never lack of. It was always a feeling that, you know what, when you can feel welcome in your own community, you can feel accepted, you can go through the same thing that everybody else is going through, and you can laugh about it as you get older. That's the sense of community. That's the sense of neighborhood. And we noticed at the same time, and I don't want to be long, is that when you turn on the TV, they were selling you a dream and a lie. And in order to achieve that dream and that lie, you had to go out and fight somebody for what they had. Whereas the peaceful way of surviving, and this is something that we maybe it's a little bit different today, but we as a people, talking about Black folks that are marginalized and those who are coming in that get some of the same treatment, do you want or desire justice and peace, or do you desire nearness to your oppressor? That's a question that we have to somehow answer, because in truth, we have all of the resources, we have all of the intellect in order to make our communities a safe and decent place to live. But unfortunately, many of us feel we have to leave in order to succeed. And in many cases, we end up leaving our own behind. And that's our greatest and most talented and educated individuals end up leaving the inner city and the hood. And then I get the memos that they're not too happy where they end up being not accepted and being rejected in communities and neighborhoods that were benefiting from the redlining. I'll end there. Takes me a minute to get started, but then I can't stop,
I have to
so
say, Brother Courtney, I was envious of your icebreaker question.
I blew that one up.
Because I was looking forward to describing the neighborhood I grew up in, which was a middle class, 99% white suburb of Buffalo with only one black family. I went to a school system from K through high school that was overwhelmingly predominantly white. And it wasn't until I went to college, Buffalo State College, west side of Buffalo, that I finally encountered the real diversity of people in my own community. And so I appreciate the question you raised, which is it possible to be complicit knowingly or unknowingly in a conspiracy? And I always, when I talk to students about redlining or racial covenants, I say it was an open conspiracy. I suspect there were very few people who are unaware of what was going on. And so, Sparkle, I warned you I was going to use this joke, but so when people ask me what I do, what my research is, and I say, well, I look at residential segregation and housing discrimination, especially its historical roots, and almost to a one, almost everyone says, we know about that. We know all about that. And when I tell them 2 or 3 actual facts, their jaw hits the floor. They clearly don't know anything about it. However, we know about that. What that really means is don't look into that. Don't talk about that. Don't recognize that. And definitely, heaven forbid, educate anyone about that. Because then you start to realize that practically every suburb around most major cities in the United States, the term that was used by a scholar was they formed a white noose around the city. And so racial covenants kept Black folks and immigrants out of suburbs, and redlining, when you were in the city, prevented you from owning a home, buying a home, or renovating a home. That's the 1-2 punch. And that resulted in 80 years of an inability by most, not everyone, but by most people of color and immigrant groups from benefiting from home ownership. And I mean, I don't have to tell either of you. I mean, the research is clear that owning a home is the single largest component of personal and family wealth and generational wealth. It's not rocket science. If anyone wants to understand the difference between white and Black families and generational wealth, the question is, how long have you owned a home in the family? It's real simple.
And to your point, fortunate because my father, he did purchase the home that when my sister was born before me, they walked into a new home, not a new home, but a home in the hood. Right. Yeah. But the reality is it was ours, and it wasn't too many on our street or in the area that actually did own their own homes. The woman that had the boarding house, she owned that. But she was a businesswoman, and she understood that there was a need in the community. And to your point, in my community, it was mixed. You would say predominantly right next to the homes was Black, but equally poor white, equally poor Hispanic, and we were all there together and found a way to make the best of it. And when you say generational wealth and owning a home, when it comes to, and I say my people, speaking of Black folks, Minister Farrakhan got around him many of the financial scholars in the Black community and asked them what would be our best investment. We have what we've been taught by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, but he asked them all what would be the best investment. And they came with, gold, they came with technology, they came with, all of the things that are out there today. And he reminded them that what we've been taught is land is the best investment that you can make. And many of them were looking for the quick grab of money, not recognizing how important land is.
Yeah.
And it ended with one of our top scholars and Professor Naim Akbar. He said the one genius about the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was that he said we need to have a moral economy. He said the financial understanding comes after you have the moral stance. You understand truly what life is all about and how you are to move and how to build community. And that's where we're lacking at. We have these deficits that keep us from home owning, even having the desire of home owning. And it's not just because of growing up in the projects or redlining, it's because of the miseducation that we've received, where we don't have a desire to really understand how important it is to own a home. But it's more than just owning a home, because many of those that had excelled and were able to have the means in this time period, we buy these big houses because this is what's advertised to us. We get them in these nice neighborhoods, but then we find out there's no neighborhood there. There's no community there. There's no interwoven community and commitment to each other. And we lack that, because where we grew up, in many cases, there was community. Where we grew up, in many cases, there was neighborhood and a feeling of belonging. And then when we move away after we have means, we like, man, I want to go back. I want to go back and get that feeling that I had when I didn't have anything. And I'm finding I've aged out, right? I got to that point, whereas I hear those stories now, and we're missing that. And the reason for having a home, the reason for being a part of a neighborhood and a community is what now on the spiritual side I see people are missing, and they're becoming empty as they get more means and get more access. They feel less and less spiritual and connected.
Yes. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I go too much. I know.
No, you can't go too much. I just was setting up the next question for Professor here. I think you pretty much touched on it when I asked which areas or populations in Utica were most affected and how redlining shaped housing, schools, and economic development locally. I guess we just really spoke about that briefly.
Well, there's a point that I can make again. Carol Crooms. She grew up in the projects. Her father had 21, 22 siblings. So when people talk about Bessie Hicks, that was who Bessie Hicks had. When they talk about Mother Lavender, they worked with Mother Lavender. So some of those that are of note in the Utica area, my family worked with, were a part of the framework of the things that they were able to do. And the projects, growing up there, she realized there was a school called Potter School. So if you lived in the projects, okay, it's kind of simple. You went to Potter School. And then somebody had the genius idea of busing. And for whatever was in her soul and her gut, she never agreed with busing. And so she's actually in the newspaper for saying that she did not want the children in the projects to be bused to the white schools to so-called get a better quality education. She said clearly that you have, to the parents, you have access to the school. You have access to the teachers. You have access to the housing, the area in which your children are going, where you can improve what you have, but it works better that it's in your reach. But as soon as you start to become bused into an area that you're not wanted, you're going to lose access. And she says, I don't need my child to sit with white children in a white school in order for them to learn. They can learn just as well in their own school. But unfortunately, the tide moved and they closed down Potter's School. And now today, Potter's School is the inside house. Isn't that crazy? And the projects are gone. But she understood community. She understood neighborhood. She understood building from what you have instead of trying to go somewhere else and fit in where you just are not wanted. So with that said, there's good things to kind of working with what you got compared to trying to be a part of something that you're being rejected. And if they won't treat you right, they absolutely won't teach you right.
And it's fortunate that you raised the Potter School, because of course that building is now part of plans to be demolished.
Oh, wow.
In a new urban development scheme that is going to occupy all the land where that old second ward was knocked down anyhow. So the new plans to develop that entire neighborhood will swallow up any and all buildings that still exist there, which of course includes the temple and the Insight House. So it's a endlessly voracious machine that you're describing. And I wanted to agree too that although it wasn't necessarily the same, I also grew up with a terribly incomplete education. And my education never taught me why anybody else but us should have houses, because from the looks of my neighborhood, everyone had one. So, that's why, going to college really opened my eyes from, my sheltered upbringing. And so when you look at both redlining and racial covenants in our area, I mean, I can rattle off the names of who was involved and what neighborhoods were involved. To what extent was that an open conspiracy? Well, redlining wouldn't work if it weren't for the complicity of realtors, bankers, and mortgage lenders, local government, contractors. There's a whole raft of people that were involved in this, in the industry of building the suburbs, who all knew what was happening and enforced it one way or another. And it led to exactly what you're describing. These two, I don't want to say hopelessly divided communities, but certainly, we don't have a wall, and we don't have a long stretch of green grass separating neighborhoods. But I think we know that the walls were there anyhow. And there are, if you go digging in the archives of the local newspapers, particularly in the 1960s, and the Observer Dispatch, doing lengthy stories on whether or not there was housing discrimination in Utica, exploring the question as if it could be debated. Yeah. So, I mean, certainly the trail is there for anyone who wants to go looking. Thankfully, thankfully you and I are in similar fields, because we're constantly asking and looking, and questioning, and we try to find facts and share them with people. So, I'll just say, boy, for a whole bunch of publicly accessible records, let me just tell you how almost impossible it is to track down this stuff. It's not you got to be obsessive to find it, because it's certainly not publicly available yet. It will be soon. I'm working on something that will be a public facing website that will explain residential segregation in all of upstate New York, including maps, deeds, racial covenants, everything. So I'm hoping that will be coming soon and will be valuable to everyday folks and educators and other scholars. Again, to sort of just present the receipts.
And this is,
And
oh, I'm listening, Brother Courtney.
well, one of the things I would like to suggest is that we absolutely have to have a new educational paradigm, meaning that there has to be a shift from the way that we're being educated, black and white and other, in this nation, because clearly for you it take to get all the way to college to see a reality different than what you had been taught. Is one thing to be in your community, but I know about Africa and I know about Asia, I know about China because I learned about it. I didn't have to go there. I didn't have to experience, but that's part of having a world view of things, is to have an education that reflects not just yourself, but all people of the planet, all people, that regardless of your color, your race, your station in life, but to have a fuller and complete knowledge of who you live around. And if, and because I'm coming from the spiritual place, if you take, I'm not saying religion, if you take God out of the classroom, I mean, we're studying him. That's without question. In every science and every math that's out there, we're studying God's creation, but we're taking him and his way out of the way of education. So the only way that we're going to be able to bridge the gap, financial and otherwise, is when we get a true knowledge, a requisite knowledge to help to raise our condition, and at the same time, a fuller and complete education across the board. And that's something that, once again, can you be part of a conspiracy and not even know it? My education shows me that the ones who have produced this educational system, they deliberately did it in order to blind people. Scripturally, we say the blind, the deaf, and the dumb, and we're not talking about physical blindness. Spiritually, we're talking about spiritual blindness, spiritual deafness and dumbness. And the folks that run this world, I don't want to use that general. The folks that at the top of this conspiracy, they know exactly what they're doing in order to pit us one against the other. And in some cases, Jeff, the revelation of the history and the receipts can cause a lot of anger. And so we have to have a balance to be able to receive the receipts of what happened to us, and at the same time be able to help those who feel a part of the conspiracy to find a way out of the conspiracy. So these are things that have to be I feel have to be discussed, and it has to come through the educational system. But they're vested, man.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Having been in this sector for 30 years, I can tell you that for someone who believes that education should be liberatory, that should liberate the mind and liberate the person, so that we can see the world clearly. Let's just say that's not how the industry views my job anymore. For better or worse, and I would say for worse, it's difficult to convince people that education is meant to liberate us, and that it's very difficult to liberate oneself without education. But as I just pointed out, I mean, I benefited from a very good elementary and secondary education, but it had massive gaps and massive blinders built into it, because I suspect there was no reason to liberate me. Now, of course there was. We all suffer. And I suffer when my fellow human being suffers.
Yes.
But that was never really part of an understanding, of what went on in the world. Because, well, I mean, as you said, we grow up in the community we grow up in. We see the world as we see it. And then there's always that moment when you have dinner over at that friend's house for the first time and you realize, oh my gosh, they do things differently in this house. It's that's one of those one of those moments when you realize, my goodness. And you mentioned driving past houses and saying that certainly not great in there either. And certainly a lot of those white homes you drove past, were struggling with ignorance, including willful ignorance, and irrational fear too, which are, as you said, to borrow your word, that's an enormous burden to carry irrational fear and then to act upon it. In my research looking around upstate New York, I've looked at tiny little communities way out, for example, Caroga Lake, which is a tiny community about 15 minutes outside of Johnstown. And there's a little community there where a subdivision was built. And I don't want to read out loud the racial covenant that was included in the deeds, but it is a laundry list of apparently all the folks that developer hated. And I mean, let's be honest. What was the fear in Caroga Lake? Who did they think was moving into Caroga Lake, New York? Let's be honest. Did it include Chinese? Did it include Hebrews? I mean, the list is enormous. And when I see those things, it's the irrationality of it that stands out the most. These absolutely irrational fears. I mean, whites only communities in Gloversville. Okay, what was the rationality behind that? I mean, certainly Gloversville, New York was a manufacturing center, right? I mean, they made gloves. It was famous all over the country. Certainly during the Great Migration, lots of folks are coming northward and looking for manufacturing centers for jobs. But boy, I'm really stretching it here to try to explain why Gloversville would need an all-white neighborhood. That's a real stretch. I mean, that's rooted in ignorance and irrational fear. But unfortunately, those same fears get repeated, today. I mean, we hear people in our community today opposing things like affordable housing units because of, what they call danger to the character of their towns and all this sort of stuff. And the historical echoes there are so loud, I almost have to cover my ears. Especially when people in communities say things like that and don't know the history of their own town. Many of these towns, I can show you the maps with all the whites only communities in them.
And to your point, the marketing of the good life is a lie. A big pharma knows, and how many carrying that burden of a lie turn to substance abuse. I mean, it's not a coincidence that alcohol is legal drug and cigarettes are legal drugs and stimulants and things to kind of take you away from the reality of life. That's not a true community. Trust me, I understand that part of it because I lived it. Being addicted to substances. But the opioid crisis and the fentanyl crisis that we're experiencing right now is showing that it's all a lie. And folks are falling in the gaps fast. And you talked about liberate, right? So not to, kind of like expose America, but life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And obviously, to the point, education is to bring out of the person that which God had deposited in the person. So to liberate is to bring out of the person that gift, that talent that has been being suppressed. And, Gloversville, they made gloves. And so there had to be a corporation. And there's nothing wrong with having corporations that also help to build the community. But when you have a corporation that's just skimming from the top and making profits that are out of this world and continue to grow and buy and acquire, and then at a certain point, they don't care about the people, be it they white or black, be it they Hispanic, Muslim, or Christian. They don't care any longer. That's where we are right now. Whereas we're starting to see that being part of that conspiracy has not netted us anything that is good for America right now, let alone for the world, as we see these multinational corporations raping and robbing nations all over the planet. So we have redlining going on here in Utica, in America, and it's been going on the planet. And, I read a book called The Creation of World Poverty. And wow, what an eye-opening book. Whereas where we've been taught that it's the people's fault, we're finding out that there's a conspirator. There's someone who has absolutely been causing these conditions here in America. I happen to work for the corrections, for Department of Corrections for 20 years. And I gotta, one of my issues was, why, if all of the guys that are being locked up are coming out of New York. The census back then was good 85% were coming out of the boroughs of New York. Why are these prisons way up in Plattsburgh and Malone and all these little small towns? And then when you dig a little deeper, you find out that there was no jobs. Somebody moved from farming, moved from industry, and then just left the people out there, you know what I mean? And decided that they wanted some votes from them people, so they promised them. So when I literally watched a town turn into a city where they built so many prisons around the area. And now the money coming from the enslavement or the incarceration of Black males going into the prison system after the crime bill. When I looked behind the scene and looked at the conditions that were taking place in these areas, teen pregnancy was higher than the Black community. Substance abuse addiction was higher than the Black community. When it came to the problems that come along with poverty, it seemed to be worse in these areas than it was in the community that I grew up in. But somebody decided that they would once again use the ignorance of Black people in order to continue the lie, instead of the people coming together and seeing who the conspirators are. So I don't, sorry about it, Spark.
No. And of course, the incarcerated count towards the head count for congressional districts, but they can't vote.
Yeah. And I used to go in and ask my counterparts in corrections, why aren't they allowed to vote? And they would say, because they're incarcerated. I said, okay, but I didn't ask you that. I asked you, why aren't they allowed to vote? They said, well, we're in a democracy and, they had a crime. I said, every democracy on the planet, every one of them, they allow their prisoners to vote. Matter of fact, did you know that there's 2 states in America that allows their prison population to vote? And, they said Florida. So I said, nah, Maine, Vermont. Go look it up. You know what I mean? So it's like, okay, that's the same thing. Redlining. It's understood. It's the same thing that has been happening for, 400 plus years.
Yeah.
And it didn't just start here in America.
No, of course not. And the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I think you missed the asterisks. You got to turn the document over to see the footnote. Yeah.
But many folks have been sold life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but they've not really received it. Yeah. They have not received life. Life only comes from your connection, spiritual. It comes from a connection with the source. And that's what they've been hiding from us in education and everything else, keeping us distracted with one another, hating on each other, instead of seeing there's no bond nor free, no Jew nor Gentile, nor male nor female. All are one, but that's the one thing they don't want to see happen, is us become one. And it does come through education. We can live peacefully together, but it might not be right now, because there's so much historical garbage and injury and healing that needs to take place.
Yep.
That sometimes, it might be better to say, you know what, I'm going to do like the Chinese did, or the Jews did, or the other communities that came here and they got strong. And once they got strong, then they can start to, and I'm one that could say they were right. Once they were trying to get themselves strong under their oppression, they kept out other people because they wanted to make sure that their community got strong. And that's something that unfortunately we have not been educated to see what's going on around us. We've been more of a useful tool to those who want to make money and have power. So, too serious.
No,
No, I'm really.
I was gonna
I'm
say, I use the same term. I use the same term you do, but I just quote Noam Chomsky, the owners of the world.
Yes.
Got the same term.
You know, and it's so bad that a family that did very well educationally here in Utica, I'll say is, well, he was one of my father's colleagues at GE who just would not accept being relegated to the red line areas. And he moved into the Far East, right? The Upper East. And when he passed away, his son contacted me to help him clean out the house. And I asked him, hey, man, how was it living up here? How was your neighbors? He said, I wouldn't know. I said, what do you mean?
Yeah.
He's like, from the time we got here, no one communicated with us. They never accepted us in the community. He said the only time they came to my house is when my father passed and the house went up for sale. Now, this individual is actually a banker who helps to establish banks and help broken Black banks, get reestablished. But he said clearly, never was accepted.
Yeah.
So there's healing that needs to take place. Once again, can you be part of a conspiracy and not even know it? Can your way of seeing life be such that you reject the people that can really help you because you've been taught to look down on? And I just happen to for better, and I might talk about it tomorrow at the Frontiers program, but I ran into an understanding of Phantom of the Opera, and to take the trappings away and then bring racial understanding into that. And I would say that that's probably what was being said and hidden in it. But it actually helps you to see clearly what has been taking place amongst Black and white, particularly here in America.
And that's exactly what's been happening here in America. And I was going to ask you, Brother Courtney, but it seems like you answered this question truly. What does this kind of history do psychologically and spiritually to a community?
So I remember Patrick Johnson, my brother, you know what I mean? Someone that grew up in the hood, Cornhill neighborhood. And he would say this: I grew up in East Utica, or it's right down the street from the county office building. But I went to school at Brannigan. It was called Gladiator School. It closed in my 6th grade. It was so bad. Poor white, poor Black, poor Hispanic. It was so bad that they closed it. But going back to looking at where I lived at, I was in the middle. So East Utica, the projects in Cornhill. And back then, Cornhill was being integrated, I guess. It was starting to change complexion as you moved up towards Roosevelt School in the 14, 15, 1600 block of Cornhill. And Patrick grew up in that area, and he said that he thought he was better than the people in the projects. He said it just was understood that since I was in Cornhill, where white people live and used to live, that made me better than the ones in the projects. Yeah, and this is an individual whom many know and see him dealing with racial justice, but he would talk about there was a word that he would use, what happens to Black folks under discrimination and racial prejudice. And he was explaining how
today too.
This is what?
It's his birthday today too.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. I'm listening.
Wow. And he would say it because he would do the presentations on racial justice. So he can articulate it very well, the psychological, man, I can't remember the word right now, but shown how it caused us to fight each other. It allowed us to commit violence against each other because of the mindset of thinking that we're better. And so, of course, if you have that kind of like on a chip on your shoulder, when you meet in a neutral or territorial area, what's going to happen? Fights are going to break out. Knives are back then. Knives are going to be pulled. Now you got families involved, and now it's understood. I'm from Cornhill, and you from the projects, and literally we had a so-called gang in the projects called the Junior Black Mafia, believe it or not. And they used to, because of the feeling of being thought as less than, now they got to show that they're not less than, in which they're not. And so they would go into Cornhill and start stuff with them. And so I'm in the middle. But the reality is I had family that grew up in the projects, and my mother was not one to want us to live where we are not wanted or feel that we are better than, because we are living with white folks that are seen, at least the way we were educated, they're better than us. They're more educated. Matter of fact, they're white, so they're purer than us. So with all of those things said, Malcolm X would say, devil's food cake is black, angel's food cake is white. So we had this psychological thing going on already. And then it becomes compounded when you have to live with individuals that take on that same mindset as those who look down on us. We start looking down on each other. So now, because some were able to move into and purchase a house or rent a house in Cornhill or other places, they start to see themselves differently. I can't say all, but this is something that Patrick made clear was amongst some of those who were able to escape the projects.
And this is Derek Bell's notion of the face at the bottom of the well, right? We live in a society where no one wants to be the face at the bottom of the well. So we're always trying to find someone that we can put lower than us for fear that we'll be the face at the bottom of the well. Sure. And I mean, those kinds of tensions, when you mentioned the projects that went up along the railroad tracks. So of course there's that whole history of constant relocation that led to that community as well. So, I mean, we can go back to the 1890s and the first Black community, on the eastern end of Main Street, right? I mean, I've only been able to find one or two sentences referring to it as Little Haiti or Little Africa was the term. And of course, as soon as a couple of businessmen figured out you could fill in those wetlands and build on them, everyone was evicted. And the majority of people ended up on Post Street. Of course, two guys bought Post Street and evicted everybody. And so folks ended up in the second ward. Second ward was demolished under urban renewal. And people were primarily relocated to the newly built, what was at the time, military housing, right? Those were military worker houses. But so the neighborhood you're describing, Brother Courtney, that was the John Bleecker urban renewal project, right? When they just knocked that entire area down, the school and all the buildings, something like 159 families relocated, all of that land behind the county office building, right? Yeah. And I've written a little bit about that. There's a terrific website called Mapping Inequality. And it's sort of the go-to website to learn about redlining all around the country. And I was really grateful to be invited to write a quick essay to give some context to the history of Utica. And so I mentioned that neighborhood as part of the so-called urban renewal process that demolished that whole central corridor of the city, especially to build the arterial, which, as we know, historically was done city by city by city. Syracuse had the same experience of destroying the 15th Ward to build the highway. And that was systematically done all across the country as well, mostly to destroy poor and Black communities with highways. The history of our arterial is when you read the newspaper articles about how it was built it's just an endless comedy of errors. The only thing that's not funny is, the 500 or more families that were forced to relocate. Sparkle, you had mentioned like what the psychological harm is, and there's a terrific book. I'm struggling to remember her name. She's a professor at Syracuse University and wrote this terrific book. She uses the metaphor of when a community is forcibly uprooted, it's like digging up a tree. So if you dig up a tree and plant it somewhere else, it'll probably survive, but it will be impacted by that shock, and it will not grow as strong as it would have had it been left in its place. And if you dig that tree up a few more years later and replant it again, well, it will be further stunted. And certainly in Utica, there's clearly been at least 4 instances of forced relocation of the Black community, forcibly relocated again and again and again. And so I think her metaphor is an apt one for communities all across the United States, that when people are forcibly relocated and uprooted, it does enormous damage to sense of belonging and culture, sense of community, but also just stability, community history, people's sense of belonging to a place, and all that feeds into people's sense of self-worth and their own belief of who and what they are. So it is a devastating process, no doubt.
So did you want to say something, Brother Courtney?
And I'm seeing how my mind is moving, is that I'll say this in trying to give a little deeper insight. Stephen Taylor, who was the first elected Black council person, I asked him, right, and dealing with the projects, and he said he lit up. He's like, wow, we had everything that we needed down there. We really didn't have to go anywhere. He's like, we didn't really know, as Jeff was saying, he was in his community. He didn't know anything outside of it. So he was content pretty much. And it was the same thing in the projects. Now, others might look in, right? Okay. But his whole spirit raised to think about how they had the businesses that they needed. They had the place to hang out where they needed. They had community. And that was what made it special, even though it was the projects next to the railroad tracks. I spoke to my aunt, who is 94 years old. She'll be 95. She grew up, like I said, with her 21, 22 siblings in the projects. She lit up. She started talking about down and over in the other house in the co-op area over here. And this is where family. And she was like, just excited, not oblivious to what others might have done to us, right? Still form community, right? When they decided to take the projects down, they didn't just do like they normally do. They sold us. Ed Hill said it like this, former council person. He said, it's not hope 6, it's hope 4. And right. And I would laugh, Ed, is hope 6. He said, no, it's hope 4, but he showed me where they wanted that land down there. So first they said that it was contaminated and that you had to move the people off it. This is what was said. He found out that it wasn't true, right? And then they started selling them how nice the houses that they would be compared to living in the projects. It'd be so much nicer, and you'd be a homeowner, right? And there'll be ways in order for you to be able to afford it and help you to be able to have a home. For someone that's lived in the projects for generations, it's not a reality. It looks like my computer's getting ready to die, Sparkle. But I watched how they used somebody in our community to sell moving out of the projects when I knew that many of those individuals wouldn't be able to afford a mortgage, even though they were bringing them into an area that was decaying. putting up a house that would be twice as much of what it would sell for. The reality was it wasn't going to work. And many of those whom they said would be able to have a nice home in a nice neighborhood and be close to their neighbors, that never happened. And it got so bad that even the buildings that they put up, the homes that they put up, was substandard, and that they had to call HUD in to look over the project because there was so much theft and corruption dealing with that project. But the difference is that they sold us that this is going to be a better life for you. And then they took the land, and now we see what's getting ready to go on down there. So we need to go back to the knowledge and education that's needed in order for us to see these things before they happen. And I happen to be one that formed a team to try to stop that or educate the people. But then there was other people in our community that believed. And then it ended up that they did come to us afterwards and asked us to how can we help to fix it so that the person's name would not go down looking like they just didn't know.
Yeah, I would just
can't hear you, Sparkle. Can't hear you, Sparkle.
Oh, that's exactly right, Brother Courtney. When I was running for city council, that's the information that got put in my face. And I'm like, excuse me? So I was given some names, and, you know, I'm running for city council 4 years ago. And how long did this drinking of the Kool-Aid happen, for lack of a better statement? And when I was told that, I was taken back, and then I had to readjust my my entry speech to people who were actually born and raised in those projects that you're talking about that's now developed and developing. And they were told that the land was deemed wasteful and they needed to move. It was toxic and they needed to move. So that I was really taken by surprise when I found that out. So, you know, some people call that redlining. I would like to call that gentrification at its best, right? You know, and it's obvious. You know, it's obvious. Some things are obvious. So before you go, Brother Courtney, I have one comment from Nancy Gasson, who's watching on YouTube. She says the education system didn't treat us differently. We were not good enough to get the same education as white students. They always cut us a step down or 2 steps down from the reading levels or even the math level of science and social studies. Okay, and we got
yeah, hopefully this doesn't die on me. I didn't understand it. My mama kind of pushed me. Like I had to take the Regents. I had to take all of these so-called. I'm not the sharpest pencil in the box, but she forced me to take these classes, whereas I didn't want to be in them. So I got the best of education, so-called, that they give. It's not the same for us as it is for them, because we have to still build our infrastructure. They're not under oppression like we're under oppression and discrimination, and we have this long history. So we need a different education, an education and knowledge within ourselves. What my mother gave me that made me so much more powerful is that she said, your name is not nigga. So if somebody calls me nigga, I have no button for you to push. You're not going to get me to respond, because my father said, if somebody can say something to you and get you to respond, they've just taken control of you. So I didn't want anybody to take control of me. So they were empowering me to not want somebody else's, but to get something and do something for myself. So the difference is the educational system was trying to educate me to fit into a system that didn't want me. That's clear. And that's just the way it is. But my mother, even though I was educated, she still educated me within myself, or she did what you said, Jeff. She liberated me to not be under the thumb or the consideration or worried about somehow pleasing the oppressor class. I didn't have to do that. So the difference was I didn't have to be the smartest kid in the class to prove that I am, able to. I can just be myself. You know what I mean? I realized truly that a lot of the white students that were in those regents and whatever extra courses, there were some brilliant ones. There was brilliant ones amongst the black ones, but many of them was just like me and everybody else.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
sometimes you find out that when you're studying white history, it's easier to absorb and see some reality and making you great than it is when a black person studies white history. One of the things, Jeff, and I want to say this, when you were talking about some of the things you were saying earlier, but I thought about when I was in a meeting with a bunch of preachers, my peers, and we were being interviewed down at the OD about how can we bring the two communities, the white community in New Hartford and the black community in the inner city, bring our congregations of Christians together. I'm a Muslim, but I'm a minister. I'm about all. So I'm sitting there and everybody's coming up with choirs and teaching each other's pulpits on Sundays and bring some of our people over. And it came to me and I said, well, we need to start teaching the truth. And I said, the first thing we can do is we can teach that Jesus, the master, according to the scripture, was a man of color. He was a black man. And the whole room got quiet. The whole room, this is over 20 some years ago, got quiet. And I said, we need to teach the truth because on the stained glass windows in the black church, we have a white Jesus Christ. Not that we have a problem with a white Jesus Christ. It's that there's a problem that you have with a black Christ. We need to get him in his right color so that everybody, or at least take the color down. It was quiet. After the meeting, just about every white pastor, preacher, spiritual leader came up to me and said, everyone knows that he wasn't European.
Sure.
Everyone knows that he could not have been a white person, particularly with blonde hair and blue eyes. I said, no, everyone doesn't know that. And I said, that needs to be corrected so that we can all start to see each other as equals. And unfortunately, we went from that place and we did but never talked about the truth. And that's something that has to come out. And I know people are afraid of the truth, but I find that people of good heart and good faith, they're able to humble themselves and they're able to accept the truth. Like I said, it's not a problem for me to worship or to believe in a white Jesus. But the question is, can my white people accept the black one? So that's something that needs to be looked at. Truth.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brother Courtney. And I'll just say I haven't got a dog in that fight because I'm a Buddhist, but I do want to say,
I know what color Buddha was too.
Absolutely, and he didn't look like me.
Absolutely.
And he also understood that we all suffer, and one of the roots of suffering is ignorance. Yeah. And the only way to heal is to first you have to open your eyes and recognize the symptoms. And when you recognize the symptoms, then you use the facts to make a real diagnosis. You have to admit what the problem is. Then you start working on healing. Any doctor will tell you that. And this was the Buddha's spiritual practice too, is to first of all recognize the facts of your mind and the world around you. And when you recognize them, now we can start talking about healing. And I think that's more than just a metaphor for us. This is a culture that has brought enormous suffering on itself.
Absolutely. There's a conspirator, Jeff.
Well, and we've had many, as well as I do, that we've had moments. We've had moments where had we gone right rather than left, or if we had gone north rather than south, there were moments we had when we didn't have to end up in this world. We didn't have to end up in this moment in history, but we have created enormous suffering for ourselves, and very little compassion and understanding of one another. So yeah, we're in agreement. Absolutely. Yeah.
Buddha, the enlightened one.
Absolutely.
And that's where Sparkle, that Nancy, there was a spiritual, not religious. We were in religion. I was raised a Christian, but my mother pulled the principles out. It wasn't just the idea of going to church and being in the choir. It was the principles of how Jesus lived and how a true Christian is to live. And it absolutely takes discipline and strength in order to live that life. But then when you go to school and everything is about the physical and the material, and you're being kept out of it, and you don't really understand, no matter how much of that education you get, there's still a barrier or a red line around you. What happens is you can have the most, my mother said this to me, she said, you can get the highest education they offer in this man's world, but there's a ceiling there that the only way that you can go through it is you have to change who you are. And if you happen to be educated and you know who you are, there's no changing who you are. I cannot change. I can't change the resonance in my voice. I can't change the place where I grew up, and I'm 315 all day long. And even though you might not know it, you know what I mean? But the reality is that I accept where I came up with, and I accept the reality of what I was born into. That's just the difference. But if I'm part of this world, what happens is, man, I got these expectations that are not true. And if I was to reach them, I've lost myself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like to say, education is not necessarily taking you higher. I prefer to think of education as taking you deeper.
Yeah. Oh man, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
That's the only way that we can really understand the world and ourselves.
Yes.
So I feel like you two gentlemen pretty much had these conversations and answered all the questions that I supposed to ask and the questions. But I do want to ask one organized question as a closing question for you all. And Jeff and Brother Courtney, this will not be our last conversation, but it would just be a closing conversation for this rolling out, or this introduction to Jeff to our community. He's been here, and I heard about him and first met him, ironically enough, on a Democratic Oneida County Democratic Committee when I was running for city council, and I heard that for the first time, and they let him get up and speak, and when he spoke, I'm like, huh? And when it was only ordained divine time that we were walking out at the same time at the parking lot, I say, hey, young man, Mr. Sir, I really appreciate what you said back there and there, so here we are today in 2026, 4 years later, having this full-blown conversation.
Yeah. And by the way, it's one thing all three of us got in common. We all ran losing political campaigns. So we all got that in common.
And what we also got in common too is the courage and the bravery and the authority to come up here and have this conversation. We all have that in common as well. So I wanted to close the conversation. A question for you, Brother Courtney, before you leave us is, from a moral and spiritual standpoint, what does justice, healing, and restoration look like in this context?
So trying not to, if my people are, called by my name. So, I did a commission hearing on reparations, and in the word reparations is repair. So many think if you give us $1, that's going to help. No, it doesn't repair us. In many cases, if you're still not truly enlightened or are ignorant to the forces around you, a fool and his money shall soon part. So it's understood that repair, well, the only one that can repair you is the one whom I say clearly. There's not a possibility in my mind that God did not see what we went through here in America. You cannot tell me a all-knowing God did not know beforehand that we would go into slavery, we would be in slavery for so many years, and then at a certain point, he would bring us out of that condition. So now I have to look at, where do I need to go in order to be restored? to find justice. I can't keep going to the same people who have deprived me of that and force them to give me something that they're not even capable of giving. So with that said, I think Jeff made it clear, I got to go within myself. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. So the scriptures are there. They just don't teach it in the way in which Jesus taught it. He said the kingdom of God is where? Well, it's up in New Hartford or North Utica or living next to white folks. That's where the kingdom of, no, he didn't say that. He said it's within you. So we have to, as Jeff said, we have to go deeper into what has been already given to us. We have everything we need, but the only place that we haven't looked for how to produce this change that we're looking for is within ourselves and towards God. So with that said, we do have the teachers that have been hidden because of this world wanting to continue to stay in existence. And at the same time, we are contributing to our suffering. It's something when you see rich people, famous people, you name it, commit suicide and die on drugs and do stupid things. And then you realize all these people that have been being sold to us as successful are not truly successful. They're empty on the inside because they're chasing a dream and a lie. So I say we have to start to look for those who are teaching how to extract the riches within yourself. And it's not about putting on diamonds or gold or what have you. It's about going in and finding those gems, those jewels, those precious, things that Allah has or God has placed in us. So that's something that, it's no other way of saying it. Jeff knows that he had to go to work in order to dig and find those precious metals within himself. I know that I had to, and there's a lot of pain in digging, and there's a lot of pain and sacrifice and making changes in your life. But guess what? You couldn't have got here. You couldn't have made it into life without struggle. So struggle is ordained, but struggle for the right things, not for the wrong things. So I leave you with that, sister. I mean, that's what comes off my spirit is that, we have to do more like this, Sparkle. Entertain these conversations where people can be exposed to real people, doing real talk, making real change, and I'm not perfect. I'm far from that. And nor am I, one whom has it all figured out. But the one thing that I do have figured out is that the one that knows it all has all the answers. And I just have to continue to dig deeper and study and challenge myself. And everyone has to climb that mountain. It's just not going to happen. Just go to sleep and pray. It doesn't happen that way. Praying is good, but when you wake up, you got to get up and answer your prayers, meaning you got to go out and search for knowledge. Said a lot.
Wonderful. And for you, Professor, I have your final closing question. It's along the same thread. I just want to put it up. So from your perspective, what would meaningful repair, correction, or forward movement look like for a city like Utica?
Yeah, so I'm not a spiritual teacher. I'm a communication teacher.
You're doing a good job, though.
Thank you. But I would say, we're constantly told that you can't legislate moralities, and that we hear that all the time. But pretty clearly, you can legislate immorality. That's pretty clear. I don't want to say that there is no practical solution to this, because as you said, Sparkle, from the very beginning, this is a result of policy. This is the result of conscious, intentional decisions by people who wanted to profit by separating people by race, and then convincing people that because you own a home and you're so deeply invested in this property, that people from different backgrounds would harm the value of your property. And that's something that haunts this culture to this day. I mean, you read it in the newspaper even today, people talking about property values and whether or not we should have integrated neighborhoods. So this was caused by policy. Can it be corrected by policy? Well, I'm not so jaded yet as to say it's not possible. I do think there are some practical solutions that are that I think any compassionate person would agree to. So I'm not going to offer a spiritual solution to this. I have my own beliefs in how I interact with everyone else around me. The Buddha taught us that when you look into another person's face, you are looking into the face of your mother, because Buddhists believe in rebirth. And so every face you see may have been your mother. And how could you treat your mother so bad? That's a very, I think, an important part of the way I try to treat other people. But when it comes to a practical solution, I think Brother Courtney made the point that, just simply providing people with homes and neighborhoods is not the only solution, because there has to be more to it, right? There has to be more than just owning the piece of property. So there has to be a change in terms of how we understand living together with each other and appreciating one another. But to be honest, we do have to find a mechanism to allow people to live together. So during the redlining period and during the period up until 1968, when racial covenants were perfectly legal, there was really no way on a large scale for us to live together and to know each other and love each other. It was much more difficult. I think some of the simplest solutions might be things like housing subsidies for first-time home buyers. Anyone, I think, who can demonstrate that they were harmed by government policy, I think, is deserving of a government redress. And certainly, I think it is not difficult for many people in the United States to demonstrate that they were harmed by redlining. And it is not hard for many people in the United States to demonstrate that they were harmed by the use of racial covenants. It's one of the motivations I have for so far having gathered evidence of this in 21 counties in upstate New York. I have the receipts for 21 counties in upstate New York of why upstate New York remains so segregated. It was intentional, it was conscious, and it was done for profit. So how do you reverse this thing? Well, I do think at the practical level, you do have to make it possible for people to own homes and to begin to benefit from that huge economic benefit of home ownership and how that translates into generational wealth. And I do think that anyone who can demonstrate they've been harmed by government policy, in this case, redlining and racial covenants. And by the way, if anyone needs any evidence, if they were, that's what all the documents and maps and deeds are that I've been gathering. That's the evidence right there. And so in many communities, if you were Black, if you were an immigrant, or if you were of any of the groups named in many of these deeds, the evidence is already there. And I think the only right thing to do is to provide some redress, I think, in the form of housing credits, meaning an amount of money that's similar to what was done in Chicago, with reparation and money derived from taxes on marijuana sales. Certainly in our county, we're now collecting taxes on legal recreational marijuana. Just as a small proposal, that money could be set aside in a rotating fund to help people buy their first home if they can demonstrate that they have been harmed by these policies. And I think it is very easy to demonstrate that you were harmed by these policies if you were attempting to buy a home anytime prior to 1968, and in some cases long after that. But that's only the getting the foot into the door of the neighborhood. And it goes back to what Brother Courtney said earlier. Who wants to live in a neighborhood where you're not welcome? Who wants to live in a place where no one will speak to you? Who wants to live in a place where the only time anyone knocks on your door is when they want to buy your house when your father's passed on? That's no place for anyone to live. So, I mean, we can't legislate morality. That has to be something that comes from a commitment to our own humanity and recognizing the same in everyone else around us. I'm afraid I'm too small of a person in the world to have an answer for that.
Not at all.
Okay. So thank you very much, you two gentlemen. Brother Courtney, did you have anything else that you wanted to say?
No. Thank you for having me and giving me a chance to get settled. And hopefully, I haven't said anything that offended anyone. And if it was said in a manner that wasn't received well, I apologize for that. So,
Jonathan, I just want to give a special shout out to the people who've been watching on Facebook and YouTube. I didn't see anybody from LinkedIn leave a comment, but they are watching. The viewership on LinkedIn and the path of professionals, or the place for professionals, are rising. So I just want to give a shout out to you all for watching. Jonathan Wright, Shatasia Edwards, Nancy, and whoever else who commented here that I miss you, Reese Darb. Special thank you for you, because the viewership is growing in this local area, and I would be remiss if I don't thank the local listeners for tuning in and having Reality Speaks TV progress and succeed in the way that we've been doing. So back to this topic, what I've been hearing from both of you is that these weren't random outcomes. You know, they were shaped by decisions. So tonight's conversation reminds us that conditions we see in our city did not happen by accident. They were shaped by policies, systems, and decisions. And understanding that history is the first step toward accountability and repair. I want to thank student Minister Brother Courtney Muhammad and Professor Jeff Miller for sharing their insight, wisdom, and truth with us this evening. And thank you to everyone who tuned in to this important conversation. If you stayed present, please tap yourself on the back. You're phenomenal. And I am Sparkle Denise. This is Reality Speaks TV, with real people, real talk, and real time. Good night. Until next time.
peace.
Thank you.
We're off the air.